Imagine creating the perfect garden, a place where you can escape from the world and immerse yourself in nature. It was my dream, and I'd spent countless hours designing it to be everything I wanted, until Karen, the HOA president, saw it. What happened next? Well, she didn't just want to admire the garden. Karen wanted to turn my private yard into a public nature reserve with guided tours, eco-friendly exhibits, and even volunteers. She claimed it was for the good of the neighborhood, but when I refused to let her take over, things got much worse. Would I be forced to turn my peaceful retreat into a public spectacle? Or would I stand my ground against the HOA and their over-the-top plans? Like the video, subscribe, and comment if you've ever had an HOA try to control your property. Have you ever faced an HOA member like Karen? Let us know your story in the comments, and stay tuned to see what happens next. When I first bought my home, I had one simple vision in mind: peace and quiet. A place where I could come home after a long day, put my feet up, and spend hours in the garden I had always dreamed of. I had never been the type to buy into flashy decor or expensive furniture. For me, the beauty of nature was more than enough. The house itself wasn't much, a cozy cottage with a large backyard. But what made it special was the garden. I turned it into a little paradise with winding paths, vibrant flowers, and rows of native plants. I made sure every detail was perfect. A small pond with koi fish, a butterfly garden in the back corner, and a swing under the old oak tree. It was everything I had ever imagined, a space to unwind and reconnect with nature. As the months passed, my garden flourished. I had even begun to receive compliments from neighbors. They would stop by, ask for advice, and marvel at how it had transformed from an empty plot into something that felt alive. I was proud of what I had created, and it wasn't just me who enjoyed it. The entire neighborhood seemed to take notice. Little did I know Karen, the HOA president, had been watching too, and she had plans to make my garden her next project. One afternoon, I heard the sound of Karen's car as it pulled into the driveway. She was a regular presence around the neighborhood, always ready to enforce new rules, monitor the lawns, and send out violation letters for the most trivial reasons. I wasn't sure why she was coming over, but I had a feeling it wasn't just for a friendly visit. "Hey, how's it going?" she said, stepping out of her car with that signature, almost smug smile. "I've been meaning to talk to you about your garden." "Oh," I said, a little cautious. I thought it was strange that she would be so interested in a private garden. It wasn't like I had any violations to worry about. Everything was well kept and within the HOA guidelines. "It's lovely, really," Karen said as she glanced around, her gaze lingering on the carefully planned flower beds. "You've done a great job with it. You know, I've been thinking your garden would make the perfect addition to the neighborhood's new nature reserve project." I blinked. "Nature reserve?" I asked. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean." "Well," Karen began, "we've been talking about turning certain properties into public nature reserves. You know, where we can host tours for the community, charge for eco-friendly exhibits, and even offer volunteer opportunities to residents. Your garden has so much potential to be the centerpiece of the project." I stared at her, not quite sure how to respond. "You're asking me to open up my entire backyard to the public? For tours?" Karen smiled. "Well, not just any tours, of course. We'd arrange them through the HO, with your approval, of course. We could even include a gift shop for visitors to buy eco-friendly souvenirs. It'll be great for the neighborhood, and think about all the exposure your beautiful garden could get." My stomach turned. This was no longer just about appreciation. Karen was trying to turn my private sanctuary into a public spectacle. I took a deep breath and looked her in the eye. "I'm sorry, but I'm not interested. This is my private property, and I'm happy with it just the way it is." Karen's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "Oh, I completely understand," she said, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "But you know, you wouldn't want to be the only one in the neighborhood not participating in this wonderful community project, right?" I wasn't sure if she was trying to guilt-trip me, but it was clear she wasn't going to drop it. And that was when I realized this wasn't about my garden at all. It was about control. Karen wasn't just trying to make my garden a neighborhood resource. She was trying to take over my private property for her own purposes. After Karen left, I stood there in my garden, still processing the conversation. It felt like an intrusion, a violation of the very space I had created for myself. I wasn't just defending my garden. I was defending my home, my space, my peace. But it didn't take long for Karen to make it clear this wasn't going to be the end of it. Over the next few weeks, she seemed to be everywhere. Her car would drive by my house every day, and her HOA team would follow shortly after. I even caught one of the inspectors standing outside my property, taking photos of my garden. It wasn't long before I started receiving letters from the HOA violation notices for things I hadn't even heard of. They cited excessive foliage and unapproved plant varieties. I wasn't surprised. I knew what this was: retaliation. Karen wasn't going to let me reject her plans without consequences. What started with a polite conversation was now escalating into an all-out HOA war. I refused to back down, of course. My garden was my right, and I wasn't going to let Karen turn it into something it wasn't. But soon enough, the pressure became unbearable. The HOA started imposing fines for the most trivial things. I was getting notices about the height of my plants that were already in place long before Karen's proposal. The water feature I had set up was now violating some obscure rule about flooding potential. It was clear to me that Karen had an agenda, and it wasn't just about preserving the neighborhood or making a nice public space. She wanted control, and she wasn't going to stop until she had it. One day, after receiving yet another notice for an illegal fence height, I snapped. I marched down to the HOA office to confront Karen once and for all. The doors were open, and I walked in, my heart pounding with frustration. "Karen, we need to talk." I didn't wait for her to invite me in. I simply walked into her office, where she was sitting behind her desk, reviewing documents. Karen looked up, her expression cold. "Ah, yes. We need to talk about your garden, I suppose." Still not on board with a community nature reserve. I crossed my arms. "I've had enough of your fines and violation notices. I didn't agree to turn my property into your public nature reserve, and I'm not going to let you bully me into doing so." Karen leaned back in her chair, a smug grin forming on her face. I'm trying to do what's best for the neighborhood. The nature reserve would bring in tourists, increase property values, and make this place even more prestigious. But you're being difficult. Don't you think you're being selfish by not participating?" I couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. Selfish? She was the one trying to take control of my home. "I'm not being selfish, Karen. You're overstepping your bounds. You can't just come into my life and decide how I should live. This is my property, and you have no right to tell me what to do with it." She stood up slowly, walking around her desk to stand right in front of me. "You think you can fight the HOA and win? You think you can just ignore the rules without any consequences?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You're making a huge mistake." I could feel the tension building. Karen wasn't just angry, she was desperate. Desperate to control and make her plans work. But I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I needed to fight back, and I needed to do it strategically. That's when I came up with a plan, one that would expose Karen's true intentions and stop her once and for all. It wasn't just about my garden anymore. It was about standing up for my rights, my property, and the whole neighborhood that had been silently letting her run wild. Now that I had decided to fight back, I needed to get my strategy in place. The first step was to gather evidence. Karen had made it clear that she was using her position as HOA president to manipulate homeowners and push through her plans. But what I needed was hard proof of her abuses of power, proof that would show everyone what she was really doing behind the scenes. I reached out to a few neighbors who had been victimized by her overreach. One woman, Sarah, had been harassed for months over the size of her rose garden. Another neighbor, Greg, had been fined for the way he painted his fence. These weren't just minor issues. Karen was actively targeting residents who didn't go along with her vision for the neighborhood. It seemed like the moment someone rejected her plans, they became her next target. I also managed to get my hands on some HOA meeting minutes. It wasn't easy, but after a little digging, I found some disturbing details. Karen had been secretly working with developers to push for zoning changes, aiming to turn the whole area into an ecotourism hotspot. The nature reserve she had been pitching was part of a larger plan to gentrify the neighborhood, tear down homes, and rebuild them for wealthy tourists and eco-conscious investors. I couldn't let her get away with this. I knew I had to act fast before her plans became a reality. The next step was to get the community involved. I reached out to people I knew who had been following Karen's rise to power in the HOA and explained what I had discovered. It didn't take long for them to realize the gravity of the situation. We were all being manipulated for the benefit of a few developers who stood to make a fortune off our homes. I organized a community meeting to expose Karen. I had the documents, the proof, and the neighbors who were willing to speak out. I knew this meeting would be a turning point. Either we would let Karen continue with her plans and watch the neighborhood get destroyed, or we would take a stand and fight for our homes. The night of the meeting, the tension was palpable. The community center was packed, and Karen was there, sitting at the front with her usual smug look. She didn't know what was coming, and that's exactly how I wanted it. I walked in, armed with evidence. I had printed out the meeting minutes, my research on the developers, and even a few recordings of Karen's conversations with the developers. I wasn't about to let her manipulate us anymore. When it was my turn to speak, I stood in front of the crowd and laid everything out. I explained how Karen had been using her position to push for her hidden agenda, how she had been working with developers to turn our homes into eco-tourist attractions, and how she had targeted homeowners who resisted. The community was shocked, and I could feel the mood shift. Karen's smug confidence began to waver. I showed the room the emails between Karen and the developers, the zoning proposals, and the lies she had fed everyone about the nature reserve. People were outraged, and the room erupted in anger. But we weren't done yet. That's when I dropped the bombshell. I had contacted the local media. I knew that the moment the press got involved, Karen's plans would be exposed to the wider public, and she would lose all credibility. I introduced the journalist sitting in the back of the room, who had already agreed to cover the story. The camera lights flashed, and the room went silent. Karen tried to interrupt, but it was too late. The truth was out. The next few days were a whirlwind. The story made headlines, and Karen's face was plastered all over the local news. The HOA was forced to hold an emergency meeting, and Karen was removed from her position as president. The developers backed out, and the entire gentrification project was called off. But the fight wasn't just about exposing Karen, it was about standing up to the abuse of power. The community came together, and we made sure that the neighborhood was safe from future exploitation. Karen may have thought she could control our homes, but she quickly learned that some things were worth fighting for. The days following Karen's downfall were a blur. It felt like the entire neighborhood was breathing a collective sigh of relief. News of the HOA president's exposure spread quickly, and the impact was felt beyond our community. Karen's manipulation and the developers' plans had been dismantled in one fell swoop, and the neighborhood was no longer a pawn in her game. The HOA, now free from Karen's control, had to restructure. A new board was elected, and the focus shifted to preserving the true spirit of the neighborhood, not profiting off it. The first thing the new board did was revoke all the plans for the nature reserve and clear any remaining fines that Karen had imposed unjustly. The community began to feel like home again, free from the looming threat of corporate interests taking over. But for me, the battle wasn't just about exposing Karen or stopping her plans. It was about something much bigger, ensuring that no one could ever take away my right to live freely in my own home. I had spent so many months living in fear that Karen would push me out, but now I knew that standing up for what's right was the key to regaining control. With the community united and Karen's plans halted, I decided to take one final step. I reached out to local government officials and media outlets to ensure that our story wasn't just swept under the rug. I wanted people to know that community action could stop corrupt power grabs. I wanted others to know that they didn't have to sit back and accept injustice. A few months later, I received an invitation from the local council to attend a town hall meeting. The topic: HOA accountability and the protection of private property rights. They wanted me to speak about my experience, and I was more than willing to share. As I stood before the council, I could see the faces of my neighbors in the crowd, some of them with tears in their eyes. The sense of unity in the room was overwhelming. We had done this together. The meeting was a turning point for the entire area. The council passed new laws and regulations that would hold HOA leaders accountable for overreach. It was a victory not just for me, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of a manipulative HOA. The new laws ensured that no one else would have to endure what we had gone through. As for Karen, she vanished from the public eye. No longer a part of the community she tried to control. The neighborhood had taken back its power, and my garden, the one that started it all, remained a peaceful sanctuary, free from the prying eyes of an overbearing HOA. It wasn't just about defeating Karen. It was about proving that the community, when united, could accomplish anything. And together we protected not just my home, but the integrity of our neighborhood. And that's how Karen's plan to take over my garden came to a dramatic end. What started as an absurd request to turn my yard into a public museum ended in a victory for the entire neighborhood. Thanks to the support of the community, we exposed the corruption, took control back from the HOA, and ensured that our homes and our privacy were protected. Like, subscribe, and comment below if you've ever had to stand up against an overreaching HOA or dealt with someone like Karen. Let us know how you fought back. Your support helps us keep these stories going, and we can't wait to share the next chapter with you. Thanks for watching, and remember, never let anyone control what's yours. Stand up for your home, your rights, and your peace.